back through them and they revised them. If you remember, in 2023, at the start of 2023, they revised the 2022 figures higher, right? Saying that inflation actually was worse than they were saying. This year, the potential is actually the opposite, because there's other measures. Trueflation is one. There's other measures of inflation, specifically trueflation, which actually shows that US inflation is actually much lower than what they think. And they have it at around 1%, I believe. 1.5%. 1.41. That's the daily trueflation rate. They have their own measure. Their measure is very interesting. It's not fucking made up out of nothing. There's actually a podcast where the guy from Trueflation, is interviewed by Pomp, who's a crypto podcaster, Bitcoin guy, and he talks about it. It's an interesting one. I'll link it along with this trade of the day. But the US reported rate is 3.4%. They're saying that it's 1.4 based on what they measure. And Trueflation were also saying that, whenever, I don't know if how much they have, but Trueflation were saying back whenever the inflation was rising, they were ahead of it, right? Whenever CPI was still low in 2021, Trueflation was much higher. They were like, no, inflation is real, it's here. And so the idea of Trueflation is that it's faster than the official rating. And it shows the general trend. Is inflation 1.41% right now? Nobody knows. But the idea is they believe that they're ahead of inflation and it's actually lower. It doesn't mean it's going to stay lower. But this would mean, if that's right, there's a good chance that the next inflation readings actually come in a bit lower. And if they come in lower, Powell can cut. He's currently restrictive. You've got inflation at 3.4%, but Fed funds are at 5.5%. That's restrictive. There's a lot of talk and pressure to say your interest rate should be down at 4%. Right? That would be more like a balanced Fed funds rate. So the only reason they haven't cut rates yet is because broadly everything's fine. Stock market's doing fine, economy's fine, employment's fine, but mostly inflation is still not back at 2%, and they don't need to wait for it to come to 2%. They just need to see it continuing to go down. So one of the things that could show that would be CPI revisions. If there are revisions tomorrow to the downside, that's going to ramp up the narrative to Powell saying, look, you've beat inflation, cut rates. And the other thing that's coming up, so that's tomorrow, which is why I'm putting the bet on today. Tomorrow could really shift those odds in poly market. Then next week, we've got CPI on Tuesday. So here's CPI, that's the inflation measure. That has next Tuesday. The expectation there for year over year is 3.4. Right, they're expecting 3.4. Sorry, previous forecast is, they don't have a forecast yet. Then we have core PPI, which is a different measure of inflation, which is on Friday next week. And then at the end of the month, we have core PCE, which is, where are we here? Wednesday, must be the following week. Core PCE is on Thursday 29th. There we are. So these are all coming up before the next meeting. This is what's going to make the Fed choose to cut or not. If we see CPI coming in lower, if we see PCE coming in lower, and if we see a revision of the last year's CPIs to a lower level, I would expect them to actually cut in March. And I think the narrative will really ramp up towards them cutting. Also, if we have a pullback in the markets, it'll make it more likely. And I do think that the S&P and the NASDAQ and all, they've pumped up quite high. They could easily have a pullback. Not a crash, but they could pull back. And if you have some banking crisis stress and all that kind of shit, I don't know. Me, personally, and this is just me, this is not a recommendation. If you're going to trade something, make your own decision. I am putting money on this. It's a 10-1, so I'm putting a very small bet on 1% of my trading portfolio. No need to go crazy. It's like a 9-1 payoff. But I personally don't think that 10% is the right number. So I think it's mispriced. I think maybe it's 20 like the Fed says, like the futures say. Maybe it's 30, maybe it's 40. But I don't think it's 10. So to understand this, you need to understand probabilities. Even if I think it's 40%, that still means it's more likely to lose than win. But if it wins, the payoff's 9-1. That makes it plus EV. So I see it as an asymmetric bet, and that's what I'm going to take. So That's how I'm going to do it. GM. See you all later.